to get a grade 9 in AQA English Language Paper 1, Question 4, and we're looking at the November 2020 paper. When I was marking this exam, I often found students wrote about the same amount that they had written for question 2 and question 3 as they had for question 4. But question 4 is worth 20 marks and questions 2 and 3 are only worth 8. You've got to write in much more detail and in much greater depth. The 2026 paper has changed slightly. I think it's more clear. So there's no more a student said, because that has gone. So you are responding directly to the statement and you must comment on the methods to justify your judgment. So we'll have a look at some of the mistakes that students make with this question. I mentioned that often they write too little. It's worth 25% of the marks of this paper. So it is an essay question in effect. There's often too little focus on the devices, and often students are retelling the story instead of evaluating the claims. You've got to really look at that statement carefully and really weigh it up. And also another mistake that students make is quoting without actually looking at the methods that the writer is using. So this question is a synoptic question in the fact that it's using, in question 2, obviously you're asked to analyse the language. In question 3, you're analysing the structure. In question 4, you're evaluating, but you're using analysis of language and you're using analysis of structure in order to help you to come to a judgment. But another mistake students make is that they only make the judgment at the end. Really, there's got to be a line of argument running through your essay. So you look at the statement, you make a judgment, whether you agree, disagree, or partially agree, or partially disagree, and that has got to run through all the way through. As examiners, we've got to see that you are evaluating. And another mistake students make is that they overquote without analysis. Your quotations have got to be sharp and laser focused. And we'll look at it in some detail, how to do this. So here's an example of a question for the 2020 paper. If you want to download that from the AQA website, you can. It's November 2020. I've adapted the question in line with the 2026, what the paper will look like in 2026. So for this question, focus on the second part of the source from line 24 to the end. In this part of the source, the writer leaves us in no doubt that the stranger child is only a product of Rosie's imagination. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? In your response, you could give your own impressions of the child, comment on the methods the writer uses to present her as real or imaginary, and support your response with references to the text. So that's the question, and these are the lines 24 to the end. So I'll read them quickly to you. If you prefer to read them to yourselves, pause the video and just whiz past. The little girl was sitting back on her heels beside a clump of daisies that grew against the fence. She had her back to Rosie and was holding tight to the handle of a large wicker basket that stood on the ground beside her. Cara seemed unfazed by the girl's presence and continued to move, engrossed, along the row of plants. Rosie bent forward to look through the clearest of the panes and peered closer. The child was small, maybe around 8 or 9, although something in the tense hunch of her shoulders made her seem older. Her hair hung down her back in a matted, dusty-looking plait, and she was wearing dressing-up clothes, an ankle-length dress and pinafore in washed-out greys and tans, like a homemade Cinderella costume. Where on earth had she come from? She must be a neighbour's child, but how had she got in? The wooden fences that separated the gardens between each of the houses and the terrace were high, surely too high for a child to climb. The child glanced over her shoulder, back towards the houses, a quick, furtive movement, as if she were scanning the upper windows of the row, afraid of being overlooked. Rosie caught a glimpse of her face, pale and drawn with anxiety, before the girl turned back and reached forward to quickly tuck a piece of trailing white cloth into the basket. Almost unconsciously, Rosie registered that the girl was left-handed like herself, and there was something animal-like in her movements, quick, like the darting of a mouse, or the flit of a sparrow, some small dumb creature that moves fast to blend into the background. Something wasn't right here. She had seen distress in those eyes. Rosie turned away, dried her hands hurriedly, and slipped on her flip-flops. She would go gently, raise no challenge about her being in the garden, but say hello and try to find out what was the matter. Maybe if she pointed out that her mother would be worrying where she was, she could persuade the girl to let her take her home. But when she stepped outside, the child was gone. Okay, so I would advise that when you reread the section before you answer this question, reread it with a highlighter and keep the bullet points in mind. Keep the question in mind, that no doubt that the stranger child is only a product of Rosie's imagination. So give your own impressions of the child. Have that in your mind. Are your impressions that the child is imaginary, or do you actually feel that the way the child is presented is real? Or do you have mixed feelings, or are you unsure? And then obviously we need to look at the methods that the writer uses to create those impressions. So let's move on. What you must do. So first of all, you make a clear judgment. You either agree, partly agree, or disagree. I would say the best thing to do would be to partly agree, or partly disagree, partly agree, partly disagree, because that shows that you are weighing the evidence. But make your decision, make a clear judgment. Then you use evidence from the set line. So you do need to make sure you're not referring to the whole of the passage, just from lines 24 onwards. You've also got to really think about the methods, the techniques the writer uses. Don't just retell the story, and keep your focus on the statement. So have that in mind. How far is that child presented as real or imagined? Okay, so we break down the statement. There's really two parts to the statement. It's only a product of Rosie's imagination, leaves us in no doubt. I would say you could agree with part of the statement and disagree with the other. So you could perhaps disagree with claim 2, leaves us in no doubt, but agree with only a product of Rosie's imagination. So your job is to test both parts. Is it definite, or is there an uncertainty? Is it clear to you that child is just a product of Rosie's imagination? Or do you think there's actually, she's presented in some way as quite, there's detail there that makes her seem actually quite real? Test both parts. Is it definite, or is there uncertainty? Do use the bullet points. These are the bullet points. Give your own impressions of the child. How is the child presented? What techniques does the writer use to present the child as either real or imaginary? Okay, so underline the opinion you're evaluating. That's always helpful to keep it in your mind. Bracket the focus lines, put a pen mark down the lines that you're looking at so you don't wander off, so you know what you're evaluating and where you're evaluating. So let's look at the child. So let's think, what are your first impressions of her? Is she presented as dreamlike? You could argue that, couldn't you? She's got this fairy tale clothing, it's compared to sort of like, she's dressed like Cinderella. She's also got these fleeting movements. She's, slightly skittish, half present. She's looking about herself, and then there's the abrupt disappearance. So that makes it seem, she seems somehow intangible there, doesn't she? Less real. But there are specific concrete details of her dress and behaviour which make her seem more real. So which impression do you feel strongest for you? I can't tell you what is the right answer. There isn't necessarily a right answer. It's how you respond. And as long as you can give evidence for it, that's fine. So which impression felt strongest to you on first read and why? So let's look at some of the methods. We do need to analyse the methods. So the first method, using simile, the writer's using similes. So this is using language, isn't it? We're commenting on the language. Like a homemade Cinderella costume, like the darting of a mouse, the flit of a sparrow. So you need to comment on these similes. What effect do they have? You might say, it links her to a fairy tale, and obviously fairy tales are unreal, they're dreamlike. So perhaps the writer is trying to create a sense of unreality about this child. We're trying to make her seem in some way almost insubstantial. And these animal motions, maybe it does create a sense of her being fleeting or ghostly. And certainly the fact that she just disappears, that she appears out of nowhere, they can't get over the fences, but she suddenly appears and then she suddenly disappears, makes her seem unreal. So you could use a sentence frame. The simile positions the child, and then you obviously pick which simile you want, positions the child as, and then you could pick out some of these unreal, dreamlike, links it to which suggests that she's almost part of a fairy tale, which implies that she's unreal. So you might want to have a go at pausing the video and writing a sentence about how those similes work at answering the question, keeping the focus on the question. Okay, so now method 2 is narrative viewpoint. Although this passage is written in the third person, we're very much seeing Rosie's perception of the events, aren't we? We're seeing things through Rosie's eyes. So we see the child filtered through Rosie's perception. There's withheld, confirmation is withheld. There's no external, there's no other person there also looking at the child. I mean, it is mentioned about the little girl, Cara, but she's not responding to the child at all, is she? What does it say? Let's go back. It says there, Cara seemed unfazed by the girl's presence and continued to move engrossed along the row of plants. So Cara isn't interacting with the girl at all. So she's not looking at her, she's unfazed. She's engrossed with the plants. So we're only seeing the child through Rosie's eyes. Here, these questions here are coming straight from Rosie's mind. Where on earth had she come from? She must be a neighbour's child. So because we're only seeing it through Rosie's point of view, it does create a sense that maybe Rosie is unreliable. There's nobody backing up what she's seen. So that does call into question the fact that this child might not be real. We're already told at the beginning of the extract that Rosie's feeling exhausted. It might be that Rosie is imagining this. The writer is leaving us, that is making it feel somehow doubtful. That can we rely completely on Rosie? Not sure. The impression created is that it could possibly be imagined. There's a lack of certainty. It's seeming somehow uncertain. So a little micro task here. Pause the video, write one line explaining how Rosie's viewpoint increases the uncertainty. You could mention that it's only through Rosie's eyes that we're seeing this child. So therefore, that makes it seem as if it could be imagined. Okay, so method 3 is the structure. Obviously, we've got the girl appearing out of nowhere and disappearing suddenly. There's that cyclical pattern. We talked about that when we were writing about structure in question 3. But the fact that she suddenly appears and suddenly disappears, then there's no explanation, there's no resolution, and the mystery persists. We've got that quotation, the child was gone, just at the end. So that use of structure implies that there's something unreal about the child, doesn't there? That there's something, there's that either she's a product of Rosie's imagination, or there's something else that implies that she's not real. Okay, so you are not only using the language to answer the question, but you're also looking at using structure too. Now, what you've got to use quotations judiciously. Using quotations like a pro. Go short and surgical. Really short quotations. Embed them into your sentences, just like you did in question 2, question 3. So these are some quotations you could choose. Embed them. Don't paste chunks. And for every quotation, you've got to name the method and the effect. So whether it's a simile, you've got to look at what is the writer trying to do here with that technique? What effect is the writer trying to create? Okay, so here's a paragraph plan you could reuse. You could do this 2 or 3 times. You make a point, and with that point, you're making a judgment linked to the statement. You keep going back to the statement, keep answering it, keep looking at it. You give evidence. Short quotation, you look at the method that the writer's using, the effect of that method, how it impacts the reader, what effect it's having on the reader, and then keep going back to the wording of the statement. So it might be something like this. The fairy tale simile, like a homemade Cinderella costume, makes the child feel unreal, as though she belongs to Rosie's imagination rather than the real garden, which supports the idea that the writer leaves us with little certainty about her being real. Okay? It does all of that, doesn't it? It makes a statement, it gives a quotation, and it gives the effect of that quotation, and it links back. So that's effective. Right, what you need to do, you need to engage with the exact statement. You need to make a clear judgment and sustain it. You need to look at the methods, whether it's similes, narrative viewpoints, structural shifts, imagery, foreshadowing, cyclical structure, and aim for balance. So the best answers weigh both sides before concluding. So they look at the arguments for why the child might be a product of Rosie's imagination and why she actually might be real. Here's some useful terminology. I haven't got time to go into all of this terminology, but perhaps we'll do that in some later videos. We've talked a bit about narrative viewpoint, where that we're seeing it from Rosie's viewpoint. Structural shift, that's where you're shifting from one thing to another, a bit like changing of focus. Cyclical structure, where the ending comes back. At the ending, you come back to the beginning in some way. Withholding information, obviously we don't know. It is a mystery. We don't know where this child's come from, where the child has disappeared to. A paragraph plan you can reuse. We've talked a little bit about this. You make a point, judicious judgment about the statement. You have evidence. You pick out short, precise quotations. You name them. You look at you explore the method that's being used. You look at the effect, how it shapes the reader's view, and then you link it back to the wording of the statement. Here are some sentence starters that you could steal. You could use these. The writer strongly suggests this implies that. However, the writer also says, alternatively, the narrative perspective may, weighing up, taken together these details, overall the effect is. So where you agree with the statement, where you look at the alternative the alternative viewpoint, and then you weigh it up, come to some sort of conclusion. So the story is told through Rosie's eyes, so we only see what she notices. So why might her viewpoint be unreliable or limited? Obviously, every single person doesn't see the whole picture. So when we're seeing through a particular character's eyes, we have to realize that their viewpoint is limited. They don't see the whole picture. And we also were told at the beginning that Rosie was feeling tired. She'd just had this move, this long journey. It was quite traumatic. The writer hides explanations, so we never fully understand who the child is. How does this withholding information keep the mystery alive? Well, it raises questions, doesn't it, in the reader's minds? And these questions do create a sense of unreality about the child. The structure is circular. The girl appears, then disappears, leaving no resolution. So what effect does the unresolved ending have on the reader? Does it make the child seem more or less real? I think it makes the child seem less real in some ways, but to me, she seems more ghost-like than a product of Rosie's imagination. I feel that because Rosie is seeing such precise details, that makes the child, to me, seem quite real. It makes the child seem real in the sense that it's real to Rosie. It's not I feel that she's probably not a product of Rosie's imagination, but not real in the sense of a real living human being. To me, she seems more ghost-like. And then obviously we've got images like twisted shadows and choking, which makes the setting feel eerie. So how do these images contribute to the uncanny mood around the child? Well, that is about the writer creating a setting which I think helps imply to me that there's something ghostly about this child. The writer strongly encourages us to read the child as imagined by Rosie by framing her with fairy tale imagery. The simile, like a homemade Cinderella costume, places the girl in a storybook register rather than a realistic one, which makes her presence feel dreamlike and unlikely. By filtering the scene through Rosie's perspective, the narrative withholds any concrete confirmation that the child is real, so the details invite us to treat her as a projection of Rosie's mind. In this way, the writer appears to leave little doubt that the child belongs to Rosie's imagination. Now, that is very, very well written. It's very clear. As I said in the past, I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's certainly top level, isn't it? I mean, it's certainly, it's done all the things that we've talked about, even engaged with the statement, picked out evidence, looked at the effect of that evidence, looked at the methods used. Yes, very, very good response. And it continues. However, it looks at the other viewpoint. However, the text also sustains uncertainty by building an atmosphere that could plausibly belong to a real external encounter. Descriptions elsewhere in the focus lines emphasize physical specifics and observed behavior which resist a purely imaginary reading and suggest Rosie is responding to something she perceives as present. This tension between fairy tale suggestion and concrete observation mean the writer does not remove doubt entirely, but instead invites debate, keeping the reader unsure. So yes, so that's really good, isn't it? This candidate is looking at the other argument that actually the child is described in some detail, which implies that actually Rosie is seeing something that is actually present, that is actually real. Overall, so there's a little conclusion here. Overall, while the fairy tale framing and filtered viewpoint push us towards seeing the child as imagined, the persistent uncertainty in the narrative prevents absolute certainty. The writer therefore leans towards the child being a product of Rosie's imagination, but does not leave us in no doubt. So that echoes back to the question, doesn't it? That the statement said that leaves us in no doubt that the child is a product of Rosie's imagination. This candidate has said, actually, there is still doubt. And they've partially agreed, but partially disagreed. So a very, very high level response. So why is it top level? It directly engages with both parts of the statement, only imaginary and no doubt. It uses methods terminology precisely and repeatedly, it integrates evidence concisely and keeps it relevant to the set lines. It balances agreement and challenge before a clear, reasoned conclusion. And it sustains a coherent line of argument throughout. So all the way through, it's focused on the question. So that's really good. So 30-second checklist. Did I state a judgment in my first sentence? Did I come to some conclusion? Am I grappling with the question? Did every quotation have a named method? So am I actually looking at the techniques the writer's using? Did I weigh both sides before my conclusion? Did I echo the statement's wording in my analysis? So showing that you keep coming back to the wording of the statement. So keep those questions, perhaps take a screenshot of that, and when you do your next question 4, have a go at it. So engage with the exact statement, use subject terminology for methods, track and weigh evidence from the set lines, conclude with a balanced argument. Okay, so that's it. I hope it's useful. If you want more help with going through each of the questions in paper 1 and paper 2, do subscribe to the channel, and I have got some useful resources, so have a look below the video to find those.